last 2 years. All have a very good scope and all are for the benefit of the environment, basically. The only problem is that the majority of them are being implemented in a very fast manner. So lots of ship owners do not have the proper time to get prepared and implement them properly, number one. Number two, lots of different organizations and countries have different different measures and different levels. Therefore, you might implement, for example, the water ballast treatment system, which is going to be acceptable in Europe but might not be acceptable in the US. So, but again, it's very bad for the ship owners. You need a more global understanding of what is acceptable and what is not. So you need all these organizations and countries to follow one rule, the IMO rule, in order to try and implement laws and measures unilaterally. And lastly, we must not forget that we are in the midst of the worldwide shipping crisis. The majority of shipping companies are losing money. Therefore, implementing such expensive measures at a time when the majority of companies are losing a lot of money, I think again is very uneconomical and will create to the bankruptcy of several companies. So again, I think we need to do two things. One, postpone the measures till we see a slightly better market, and two, have the organization and countries under better cooperation, so you have one law, one rule, and not various conflicting rules.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your time.
It was one of those few conferences where I had to do a lot of preparation before coming here, because we were talking about issues which are fairly confrontational. There's a lot of inconsistency in the laws and regulations. It is quite almost embarrassing for an industry of this caliber to have been involved with so many scenarios. We have so many contradictions of how all laws and regulations apply. It couldn't have come at a worse time, because the shipping industry is going through a very difficult phase where it's not just a matter of being a bad shipping market, it's a bad banking market. I mean, we have a massive world banking crisis. There's no funding around. These people are referring to the idea of applying regulations which, from the point of view of timing, it's impossible to go and even comply with. I mean, it's not just a matter of what regulation you set. You have to set a regulation and give reasonable time for the industry to comply. What they're doing now is that we have a situation which, as was mentioned during the North Shipping conference, the president of the ICS, who mentioned that effectively, well, let's not get too worried about the $1 trillion figure, because that's too scary. He mentioned that effectively, to comply with these regulations between the year 2015 onwards for a period of 10 years, it's going to cost the industry in excess of $50 billion. I repeat, $50 billion. Now, how can you have a situation like that, or have that kind of requirement, and not only that, you haven't even got set rules and regulations. Here we had the Coast Guard representative, North, and the man is an experienced man, he's been around, and it's been embarrassing actually having to be critical, because he obviously represents what then the US Coast Guard in the States. But it's not really his fault. There's other parameters behind the Coast Guard. I mean, scenes in terms of the politics, or how the political situation or the legal system works in the States, where they've implied laws and regulations now which they can't even revoke. So effectively, I think the only thing which was perhaps colourful and effective by my conference, or my presentation, was my Otto Bismarck quote, which says that sausages and law, they're two things which you just don't want to know how they're made. And I think that's probably the most relevant thing I had to say. And I think the audience in particular was endorsing what we said. George Grassos, as you know, is probably one of the most experienced and knowledgeable people in this field. And I think with that team we had in the panel, I think we did some good work, and I think we had a good response from the audience. When you're dealing with politicians, you've got to speak their language. To speak their language, you have to do the lobbying process, even if it's not everyday things. We're not politicians, we're businessmen, we're ordinary business people, we just work for a living. Politics is different scenarios, different science, if you want to use that term, if you want to use it so sophisticated. But the point is, it still needs a way of communicating. You cannot expect the draftsmen who sitting back there hadn't the faintest idea about shipping, which has been proved by the regulations they're making. But the only way to convince them is you've got to spend time and effort, create groups, go to the European Commission, visit them. I'm not saying brainwash them, but speak on their terms with their language.
Basically, shipping is environmentally friendly, but of course the regulations and the political regime requires, of course, some changes, but those changes, the way that they require them, is not necessarily harmonious with the industry, because the market of shipping is right now also in a very difficult situation with a very low market, and there are many ships out there that will not be able to comply, and the timeline that the politicians have set are unrealistic for shipping. Now, on the other hand, of course, shipping and ship owners are willing and wanting to commit to being able to have a lower impact on the environment. But as Mr. Grazzo said in the conference as well, ships 30 years ago were actually more environmentally friendly than they are today in some cases. And the market itself has a very important impact. Whether if the market's very good, ships are going faster, they produce more carbon basically. So what we're trying to say in these conferences is something, there needs to be a dialogue, continuous dialogue, a better understanding from politicians and from the people as to the complexities and how difficult it is, and to listen to the ship owners as to how to implement these changes, and some of them may be not valid. So, Mr. Grazzo mentioned that, maybe ballast water management may not necessarily be the ideal solution, or some of these technological changes that they're trying to implement on the ships. And at the same time, the cost of those implementations is very difficult for a lot of ship owners, so that creates a lot of stress within the industry. And there needs to be a way to smoothen out that process. So through dialogue, we hope that politicians will listen, especially now with the ballast water. As I mentioned, we have ships that need to implement within the next 12 months, and there's no way we'd be able to do that if there's going to be enough systems or the right systems, and there's too much risk because they haven't even been approved for a long period of time. So if you invest in something, put it on board the ship, and then that particular piece of equipment is not going to be approved for more than 5 years, then you just throw, let's say, $700,000, $1 million away. So this is a very important discussion. When you talk about new buildings, and I think this is where you have the opportunity to buy a vessel which has the new equipment on board. You have the time, the lead time to prepare for the new regulations. But for existing ships, it's very difficult in terms of the logistics, in terms of the costs, and being able to make it really feasible. So there's a difference there, but the Greeks are investing in new ships, although already there's too many ships versus the market for these ships. So it needs to take time, you have to spread out those requirements. That's the main theme, I think, that people should take away from this kind of conference, is we can set those goals and try and implement them, give enough time for the industry to come around to putting it in place.
Thank you very much.